Steve Harvey destroyed a racist man who insulted a black family's intelligence, and what happened next will shake you to your core. This isn't just another confrontation video. This is the moment racism itself got dismantled on live television, in front of millions. But here's what makes this absolutely devastating. It wasn't just words thrown around. It was a systematic, undeniable destruction of every racist lie, every stereotype, every excuse using facts, dignity, and truth as weapons. By the end, you will understand why this moment went viral worldwide and why one man's entire worldview collapsed in real time. Stick around, because the payoff is absolutely brutal. It was just another Saturday afternoon at the Westchester Mall, the kind of day where families go to shop, grab lunch, and enjoy their weekend without a care in the world. The sun was streaming through the glass skylights, casting warm shadows across the marble floors. The food court was buzzing with laughter. Children ran between storefronts while parents browsed the latest collections. It was the perfect picture of American suburban normalcy. The Johnson family, Marcus, his wife Tanya, and their 2 teenage kids, Deshaun and Alicia, were doing exactly that. They were living their lives, completely unaware that this ordinary Saturday would become the day everything changed. Marcus was a successful accountant at one of the largest firms in the city, the kind of man who worked his way up from nothing through sheer determination and intelligence. Tanya was a marketing director at a Fortune 500 company, respected by her colleagues, known for her strategic thinking and leadership. Their kids were straight-A students, both already thinking seriously about college, both involved in multiple extracurricular activities. Deshaun was on the debate team and had won 3 regional competitions. Alicia was captain of the volleyball team and volunteered at the local community center teaching younger kids to read. They were living the American dream, quietly, peacefully, completely unaware that their lives were about to be tested in a way they never imagined. They were walking past a high-end clothing store, the kind with marble counters and designer brands that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The store was elegant, sophisticated, the kind of place that catered to people with money and taste. Marcus had just bought himself a new blazer, and Tanya was looking at a dress for an upcoming company gala. The kids were joking about something they'd seen in another store, their laughter filling the air around them. They were happy, they were together, they were in their own world. That is when it happened. A man in his 50s emerged from the crowd, well-dressed in an expensive suit, his hair perfectly groomed, his watch probably worth more than a car. He had the kind of confidence that comes from decades of unchecked privilege, the kind of man who'd never been told no and had spent his entire life believing that his success was purely a product of his own superiority. His name was Robert Caldwell, a retired businessman who made his fortune in real estate and stock trading. He was the kind of person who attended country clubs, donated to political campaigns, and believed deeply in the privacy of his own mind that some people were simply born better than others. Caldwell locked eyes with Marcus, and in that moment, something dark and ugly crossed his face. It wasn't a momentary flash of judgment. It was something deeper, something rooted in decades of prejudice, fear, and a desperate need to feel superior to someone, anyone, just to confirm his own twisted worldview. "You know, it's amazing how you people manage to afford clothes from places like this," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with condescension so thick you could cut it with a knife. He looked Marcus up and down, his eyes filled with contempt. "I guess affirmative action really does work, huh? Must be nice not having to actually earn anything. Must be nice getting handed opportunities just because of the color of your skin." He paused, letting the poison sink in, watching for a reaction. He wasn't done. "I bet your kids couldn't even pass a basic intelligence test without a handicap," he continued, his eyes now moving to Deshaun and Alicia. "Probably got into whatever schools they in because of quotas, right? That is how it works for you people. You don't have to be smart. You don't have to work hard. You just have to complain loud enough, and society bends over backwards to give you everything." The words hit like a physical blow. Tanya felt her chest tighten, her heart rate spike. The air around them seemed to freeze. Deshawn's hands clenched into fists. Alicia looked down at her feet, her face flushing with a mixture of anger and shame that she shouldn't have felt, but that racism has a way of injecting into your veins no matter how intelligent you are. Marcus's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. His muscles tensed. Every part of his body wanted to respond with fury, to defend his family's honor, to make this man understand exactly what he was. But here's what Caldwell didn't expect her. What made this moment so powerful. The Johnson family didn't explode. They didn't scream. They didn't curse him out or get physical. They didn't give him the reaction he was secretly hoping for, one that would confirm his twisted beliefs about black people being aggressive, angry, unable to control their emotions, and therefore somehow justifying his prejudice. Instead, Marcus took a deep breath. He looked Caldwell directly in the eyes, not with anger, but with a kind of sad clarity. And he said something that would echo through the rest of the story, something that would become the foundation for everything that came next. "Sir, I feel sorry for you. I really do. Because you were so consumed by hate that you can even see the people in front of you. You can to see that my wife is a director at her company. You can to see that my son is on the debate team and has won 3 regional competitions. You can to see that my daughter is captain of her volleyball team and volunteers in the community. You can to see any of that because you've already decided who we are. And that is a tragedy. That is a tragedy for you, because you'll never know what it's like to see people as they actually are." Then he took his family's hand and walked away, their dignity completely intact. They didn't run. They didn't cry, at least not where Caldwell could see them. They simply walked, their heads held high, their unity unbroken. But what the Johnson family didn't know was that someone powerful had witnessed everything. Someone with a platform, someone with millions of viewers who trusted him, someone who would make sure the world knew exactly what Robert Caldwell really was, and in doing so, would expose the entire system of racism that allows men like him to exist unchecked in society. That person was Steve Harvey. 3 days later, Robert Caldwell thought the incident at the mall was behind him. He'd already forgotten about it, or so he told himself. He was a man accustomed to moving through the world without consequences. A man who spent 58 years believing that his wealth and status insulated him from accountability. He had no idea that the universe was about to deliver a reckoning he could never have anticipated. Caldwell was a regular, viewer of talk shows, not because he was interested in genuine human connection or learning, but because he enjoyed the spectacle, the drama, the way people's lives were dissected for entertainment. He watched from his leather recliner in his penthouse apartment, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, feeling superior to the guests and their problems. He considered himself above it all, too smart, too successful, too important to ever be caught in the kind of situations that plagued ordinary people. That fateful morning, he was flipping through his television when he saw the advertisement for the Steve Harvey show. He almost didn't watch it, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was fate. The promo mentioned a powerful confrontation about racism in America and featured a clip of a black family at a mall. Caldwell's stomach dropped. He recognized the setting immediately. He recognized the family. His first instinct was to turn it off. His second instinct was to call his lawyer. But his third instinct, the one driven by ego and the delusional belief that he could somehow defend himself, was to watch. He wanted to see what they said. He wanted to prepare his narrative, his defense, his justification for why he said what he said. He had no idea what was coming. The show began like any other episode. Steve Harvey walked out to thunderous applause, his signature smile lighting up the stage. He was charismatic, commanding, the kind of presence that immediately captures your attention. But today, there was something different in his energy. There was a purpose. There was a mission. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve began, his voice measured and serious. "Today we were going to talk about something that's been happening in our country for far too long. We were going to talk about racism. We were going to talk about the people who think they can demean others, dehumanize others, and walk away without consequence. And we were going to show you what happens when someone with a platform decides to stand up and say, "Enough is enough." The audience erupted in applause. Caldwell felt his palms begin to sweat. 3 days ago, Steve continued, a family went to a shopping mall. They were just like any other family, a mother, a father, 2 kids. They were shopping, enjoying their day, and they were approached by a man who decided to tell them exactly what he thought about them, about their intelligence, about their right to be in certain spaces. That man thought he could say whatever he wanted and walk away. He thought there would be no consequences. Steve paused, letting the tension build. The camera panned across the audience, showing faces of people who were beginning to understand what was about to happen. Well, that man was wrong. Because I was there, I saw it, and I'm not letting this go. Caldwell's hands were shaking now. He set down his scotch glass before he dropped it. The Johnson family walked out onto the stage. Marcus, Tanya, Deshawn, and Alicia. They looked nervous but dignified. The audience gave them a standing ovation. Steve embraced each of them, his warmth and genuine care evident in every gesture. "Tell America what happened," Steve said, looking directly at Marcus. Marcus recounted the incident with remarkable composure. He didn't embellish, he didn't exaggerate. He simply told the truth. He described the words Caldwell had used, the tone in his voice, the way he looked at his children as if they were somehow less than human. As Marcus spoke, the camera occasionally cut to the audience, showing people shaking their heads, some with tears in their eyes. Tanya spoke next, her voice trembling slightly as she described how the words had made her feel, how she had to comfort her children afterward, how her son had asked her that night if what the man said was true, if he really wasn't smart enough to earn his place in the world. Deshawn talked about being a debater, about winning competitions, about how those words had made him question himself for the first time in his life. Alicia spoke about volunteering, about community service, about the shame she felt even though she done nothing wrong. By the time they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Then Steve did something that would become the viral moment, the moment that would be replayed millions of times, the moment that would define this entire encounter. "I want to bring out the man who said these things," Steve announced. "I want America to hear directly from him why he thought it was okay to speak to a family this way." The audience gasped. Some people booed. Caldwell, watching from his penthouse, felt his entire body go cold. He knew what was about to happen. He knew he'd been set up, and he knew there was no way out. Robert Caldwell walked onto that stage, and in that moment, he had no idea that his life was about to be completely dismantled, not through anger or aggression, but through the most devastating weapon of all, the truth. Robert Caldwell walked onto the stage with the confidence of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. His suit was pristine, his hair was perfectly groomed, his posture was rigid, defensive, but he was still operating under the delusion that he had control of the situation. He was a businessman. He was used to negotiations, to spin, to framing narratives in his favor. He had no idea that he was about to face an opponent he could never defeat. Steve Harvey stood up from his chair and extended his hand. Caldwell shook it, his grip firm, trying to project strength, but his eyes betrayed him. They were darting, nervous, calculating. "Robert," Steve began, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge, "thank you for being here. I want to start by asking you a simple question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did you or did you not approach the Johnson family at Westchester Mall 3 days ago and make the statements they just described?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. He prepared for this. He had his defense ready. "Look, I may have made some comments," Caldwell said, his voice measured, attempting to sound reasonable. "But I think things are being taken out of context. I was just making an observation about how society works. I wasn't trying to." "So you did say those things," Steve interrupted, his voice sharp. "You did tell a man that he couldn't afford to shop at a certain store because of his race. You did suggest that his children got into school because of affirmative action rather than merit. You did imply that black people don't have to work hard or be intelligent to succeed. Is that correct? I was making a point about Caldwell started again. Yes or no, Steve said, his tone brooking no argument. Did you say those things? The audience was silent. The tension was suffocating. Yes, Caldwell finally admitted, but not in the way they recharacterizing it. I was just being honest about how I see the world. And there it was, the moment of brutal honesty. The moment Caldwell inadvertently revealed the truth that would become the foundation of his complete and utter destruction. Steve leaned back in his chair, and a slight smile crossed his face, and not a smile of amusement, but a smile of someone who knows they were about to deliver a masterclass in truth-telling. You were being honest about how you see the world, Steve repeated, his voice dripping with understanding. Okay, let us talk about that. Let's talk about how you see the world, Robert, because I have some questions for you, and I want you to answer them truthfully. Are you ready? Caldwell nodded, but his confidence was beginning to crack. Beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. First question, Steve said, standing up and beginning to pace. Marcus Johnson is an accountant at one of the largest firms in the city. He makes 6 figures. He has a house in the suburbs. He has raised 2 children who are both straight-A students. Tell me, Robert, how many of those things did he accomplish through affirmative action? I didn't he say, Caldwell began. Just answer the question, Steve interrupted. How many? Caldwell was silent. I'll answer it for you, Steve continued. All of them. According to your logic, every single accomplishment in his life is because of affirmative action, right? That's what you believe? No, because that's what you said. Steve pressed on, his voice growing more intense. You said he couldn't have earned his position. You said he must have gotten it because of his race. So either you believe that everything he's accomplished is unearned, or you're a liar. Which is it? The audience was completely silent now. This wasn't entertainment. This was something far more powerful. This was a man being forced to confront the logical conclusions of his own prejudice. Second question, Steve continued, his pace quickening. Deshaun Johnson is on the debate team. He's won 3 regional competitions. His debate coach is a white man named Professor Mitchell. I spoke to Professor Mitchell before this show. You know what he told me? He told me that Deshaun is one of the most intelligent, articulate, and prepared debaters he's ever coached. He told me that Deshaun has beaten competitors from private schools, from wealthy neighborhoods, from families with every advantage, and Deshaun beat them on merit, on pure, undeniable merit. Steve stopped pacing and looked directly at Caldwell. So when you said that Deshaun couldn't pass a basic intelligence test without a handicap, what exactly were you basing that on? His skin color? His last name? The fact that you saw him in a mall? Caldwell's face was turning red. He was beginning to understand that there was no escape, no clever argument that could save him. Third question, Steve continued, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. Alicia Johnson volunteers at the community center. She teaches children to read, children whose parents work multiple jobs and don't have time to help with homework, children who are struggling, and Alicia, a teenager, dedicates her time to helping them. Tell me, Robertus, that the behavior of someone who doesn't work hard? Is that the behavior of someone who has been handed everything? Caldwell opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I'll tell you what I think, Steve said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, which somehow made it even more devastating. I think you have spent your entire life believing that your success is a product of your own superiority. I think you've told yourself that story so many times that you actually believe it. I think you look at people like Marcus, like Deshaun, like Alicia, and you can comprehend how they could possibly achieve what they've achieved without some kind of unfair advantage. Because if they can achieve it, then your entire worldview collapses. If they can be successful, intelligent, hardworking, and dedicated without being white, then what does that say about you? The audience erupted in applause. Some people were standing. Some were crying. It says that you were not special, Steve continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. It says that you were not superior. It says that your success isn't a product of your intelligence or your work ethic. a product of a system that was built to give you advantages that people like Marcus never had. And instead of acknowledging that, instead of feeling gratitude for the head start you were given, you have spent your life trying to convince yourself that you earned it all, that you were better, that people who look different from you are somehow less capable. Caldwell's face had gone pale. He looked like a man whose entire identity was crumbling in real time. And the worst part? Steve continued, his voice now soft but absolutely lethal. The worst part is that you pass this poison on to everyone around you. You've probably influenced your children, your grandchildren, your employees, your friends. You've spent decades spreading this ideology, this lie, this toxic belief system. And you did it because you were afraid. You were afraid that if you acknowledged the truth that success isn't determined by race, that intelligence isn't determined by skin color, that hard work isn't a white monopoly, then you'd have to admit that you were just an ordinary man who got lucky. The audience was on their feet now, applauding, some of them openly weeping. Steve sat back down in his chair and looked at Caldwell with something that might have been pity, but was more accurately described as the look of someone who had just dismantled every lie a person had built their life upon. "You can go now, Robert," Steve said quietly. "Go home. Think about what you have heard today. Think about the Johnson family. Think about your own life. And ask yourself, is this really who you want to be? Is this really the legacy you want to leave?" Caldwell stood up, his legs shaking. He looked out at the audience, at the Johnson family, at Steve Harvey. And for the first time in his life, he saw himself as others saw him, a man consumed by fear, masquerading as superiority, spreading hate because he was too afraid to face the truth. He walked off the stage in complete silence. The episode of The Steve Harvey Show aired that evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Within minutes, clips began circulating on social media. Within an hour, the hashtag Caldwell confrontation was trending worldwide. Within 24 hours, the full episode had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. But this wasn't just another viral moment that would be forgotten in a week. This was something far more significant. This was a cultural reckoning that would ripple through American society in ways that nobody could have predicted. By the next morning, Robert Caldwell's identity had been fully exposed across every major news outlet. His business dealings were being scrutinized. His past statements, comments he made at country clubs, in board meetings, in private emails that somehow found their way to journalists were being unearthed and published. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had spent decades cultivating an image of respectability while harboring and spreading deeply racist ideologies. His company, Caldwell Real Estate Holdings, began hemorrhaging clients. Major corporations that had done business with him for years quietly severed their relationships. His country club asked him to resign. His own family member's daughter, who worked in civil rights law, and his son, who was a diversity consultant, publicly disowned him, releasing statements that condemned his behavior and apologized for any harm his views may have caused. But the most significant impact wasn't on Caldwell himself. It was on the broader conversation about racism in America. The Steve Harvey Show episode became a teaching tool. Universities incorporated clips into their curriculum on race relations. High schools showed it in history classes. Corporate diversity training programs used it as a case study in unconscious bias and systemic racism. Mental health professionals cited it as an example of how confrontation, when done with intelligence and compassion, could sometimes break through the walls people build around their prejudices. The Johnson family became unlikely celebrities, but they handled their newfound prominence with remarkable grace. Marcus was invited to speak at business conferences about diversity in corporate America. Tanya launched a podcast about overcoming racism in the workplace. Deshaun, inspired by his experience on The Steve Harvey Show, decided to pursue a career in civil rights law. Alicia expanded her volunteer work and started a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing educational support to underprivileged children. But perhaps the most unexpected development came 3 months after the episode aired. Robert Caldwell, sitting alone in his penthouse, watching his life crumble around him, did something that nobody expected. He reached out to Steve Harvey, not through lawyers or publicists, but directly. He asked for another conversation, this time off camera, this time private. Steve, who had spent his entire career believing in the possibility of human transformation, agreed to meet with him. What happened in that meeting would never be fully disclosed. But what we do know is this: Robert Caldwell underwent a profound change. He hired a therapist who specialized in helping people unpack their racism and prejudice. He began reading extensively about the history of systemic racism in America. He reached out to the Johnson family and apologized, not a performative apology designed to rehabilitate his image, but a genuine, tearful acknowledgement of the harm he caused. More significantly, he liquidated a substantial portion of his assets and established the Caldwell Foundation for Racial Justice and Equity. The foundation provided scholarships to Black students pursuing higher education. It funded community centers in underserved neighborhoods. It supported organizations working to dismantle systemic racism. Was this redemption? Was this enough to undo the decades of harm he caused? That was a question that people debated endlessly. Some believed that Caldwell's transformation was genuine. Others believed it was merely an attempt to rehabilitate his image and escape the consequences of his actions. The truth, as is often the case, was probably somewhere in between. But what was undeniable was that the Caldwell Foundation did real good. It changed lives. It provided opportunities to people who might never have had them otherwise. And in a strange, ironic twist of fate, Robert Caldwell's money that had been accumulated through a system that had benefited from racism and inequality is now being used to fight against that very system. The Steve Harvey Show episode also sparked a national conversation about accountability. Major corporations began implementing more rigorous diversity and inclusion programs. Universities expanded their curricula to include more honest discussions about racism. Politicians began taking racial justice more seriously. Was it all because of one episode of a talk show? Of course not. But it was a catalyst. It was a moment that helped shift the cultural conversation in a meaningful way. 6 months after the episode aired, Steve Harvey sat down with the Johnson family for a follow-up interview. The ratings were even higher than the original episode. But this time, the conversation wasn't about confrontation. It was about healing. Marcus talked about how the experience had deepened his commitment to mentoring young Black professionals. Tanya discussed how her podcast had become a platform for hundreds of people to share their stories of racism and resilience. Deshaun announced that he'd been accepted to Harvard Law School with a full scholarship, and he dedicated his acceptance to everyone who'd ever been told they weren't smart enough. Alicia revealed that her nonprofit had already helped over 500 children improve their reading skills and had plans to expand to 10 cities across the country. "The thing I want people to understand," Marcus said, looking directly into the camera, "is that this isn't about one man. Robert Caldwell is just one example of a much larger problem. But what this experience taught me is that change is possible. Understanding is possible. Growth is possible. It's not easy. It's not quick. But it's possible." Steve nodded, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of a man who had dedicated his life to believing in human potential. "And that's the message I want to leave people with," Steve said. "Yes, we need to hold people accountable for their racism. Yes, we need to expose it, confront it, make it clear that it's not acceptable. But we also need to believe in the possibility of change. We need to create pathways for people to do better, to be better. Because at the end of the day, we're all human. We all have the capacity to grow." The camera panned across the audience, showing people of all races, all backgrounds, all walks of life, standing and applauding. It was a moment of genuine hope, a moment that suggested that maybe, just maybe, America could begin to heal from the deep wounds of racism that had plagued it for centuries. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the Johnson family sat together in their living room, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past several months. The air was filled with a sense of accomplishment, but also an awareness of the work still to be done. They had become symbols of resilience and hope, but they knew that their journey was only beginning. Outside their window, the world had shifted in subtle but significant ways, and they were acutely aware of their role in catalyzing that change. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face as he gazed out at the darkening landscape. "You know," he began, his voice measured and reflective, "when we first went on that show, I never imagined it would lead to this. I thought we were just standing up for ourselves, for our dignity. I didn't realize we were stepping into something much larger, something that would resonate with millions of people across the country and beyond." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. "That day at the mall, when that man approached us with such vitriol, I felt angry. I felt violated. But I also felt something else, a determination that this couldn't happen to us without consequences. I wanted him to understand the impact of his words, not just on us, but on everyone who hears them and internalizes that message of inferiority." Tanya nodded in agreement, reaching over to squeeze her husband's hand. "It started with our experience, but it quickly turned into a broader conversation about race, privilege, and accountability. I've received countless messages from people who were inspired by what we did. People who felt empowered to speak out against racism in their own lives. People who said that watching us stand up gave them the courage to do the same. That's something I never expected." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood they had called home for the past 15 years. "I've also received messages from white people who said that the episode made them reflect on their own biases, their own complicity in a system that privileges them. Some of them have told me they've had difficult conversations with their families, challenging racist rhetoric they've heard their whole lives. That takes courage, and it gives me hope." Tanya's voice grew stronger as she continued. "What struck me most was hearing from parents who said they showed the episode to their children. They said it sparked conversations about race, about fairness, about what it means to treat everyone with respect. If we can change the way young people think about race, if we can instill in them a sense of empathy and justice, then we're recreating a foundation for a better future." Deshaun, who had been quietly contemplating his own future, suddenly spoke up with the passion of a young man who had found his calling. "It's crazy how one moment can change everything. I used to think my dreams of becoming a lawyer were just that, dreams. But now I feel like I have a responsibility to help others. I want to fight for justice, to ensure that no one else has to face the kind of prejudice we experienced." He stood up and began pacing, his energy filling the room. "I've been researching civil rights cases, studying the legal strategies that have been used to combat discrimination. I want to be the kind of lawyer who doesn't just represent individuals in court. I want to work on systemic change. I want to challenge policies that perpetuate inequality. I want to be a voice for people who feel like they don't have one." Deshaun's eyes glistened with emotion. "And I want to do this not just for Black people, but for all marginalized communities. I want to understand how racism intersects with other forms of discrimination, how it affects LGBTQ+ individuals, how it affects immigrants, how it affects people with disabilities. I want to be a lawyer who fights for everyone who has been pushed to the margins of society." Alicia, who had been scrolling through her social media feed, suddenly set down her phone with excitement. "And it's not just about us anymore. My nonprofit has been partnering with schools all over the country. We were not only teaching kids to read, we were also helping them build confidence. We've created mentorship programs where older students help younger ones. It's amazing to see how quickly they bond and support each other." She pulled up her laptop and began showing her family the impact metrics from her organization. "In the past 6 months, we've worked with over 500 children. Their reading levels have improved by an average of 2 grade levels. But more importantly, their self-esteem has skyrocketed. Teachers are reporting that these kids are more engaged in class, more willing to participate, more confident in their abilities." Alicia's voice was filled with pride and purpose. "We've also started a program where we bring in successful professionals from the community to talk to the kids. We want them to see people who look like them in positions of power and influence. We want them to understand that their dreams are not just possible, they're achievable. She paused, her eyes reflecting the passion that had become the driving force of her life. What's really beautiful is how the kids have started supporting each other. They've created study groups. They celebrate each other as successes. They rebuilding a community of learners who lift each other up. That's the real power of education. It's not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about building relationships and fostering a sense of belonging. Marcus smiled, pride swelling in his heart as he listened to his children articulate their visions for the future. That's the real power of this whole experience. It's about breaking down barriers and building bridges. We're not just sharing our story, we're recreating a community, and that community is growing exponentially. He stood up and joined his wife at the window. I've been thinking a lot about my role in all of this. As an accountant, I work with numbers every day. But what I've realized is that numbers tell stories. They reveal patterns. They expose inequalities. I want to use my skills to help organizations understand the financial impact of discrimination and inequality. Marcus continued with growing conviction. I've started consulting with nonprofits and community organizations, helping them understand their budgets, identify areas where they can be more efficient, and plan for sustainable growth. I'm also working with schools to analyze their funding disparities. Did you know that schools in predominantly black neighborhoods receive significantly less funding than schools in predominantly white neighborhoods? That's not an accident. It's a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. He turned to face his family, his expression serious but hopeful. I want to be part of the solution. I want to use my expertise to help level the playing field. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about individual racism, it's about systemic racism. It's about the structures and institutions that perpetuate inequality. We need to change those structures. As they discussed their plans for the future, the conversation shifted towards their upcoming speaking engagements. They had been invited to various universities, community centers, and corporate offices to share their story, to educate others about the realities of racism and the importance of inclusivity. The calendar on their refrigerator was filled with dates and locations, a testament to the demand for their message. We have to make sure we were not just telling our story, Tanya emphasized, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had thought deeply about this issue. We need to focus on actionable steps. It's not enough to just raise awareness. We need to provide people with tools they can use to combat racism in their own lives. We need to create a dialogue that encourages understanding. She pulled out a notebook filled with ideas. I've been thinking about what we could do at each speaking engagement. We could start with our story, of course, but then we could break into smaller group discussions. We could ask people to share their own experiences with racism both as perpetrators and as victims. We could create a safe space for vulnerable conversations. Marcus agreed, building on his wife's ideas. And we have to address the complexities of privilege. It's not just a black and white issue. It's about class, gender, sexuality, disability, and a multitude of other factors. We need to help people see the intersections of these issues and how they impact different communities. A person might be privileged in one way, but marginalized in another. Understanding that complexity is crucial. He began sketching out a framework on a piece of paper. We could use what's called an intersectional lens to analyze different scenarios. We could ask people to consider how their identities intersect, how they've benefited from certain privileges, and how they've been marginalized in other ways. That kind of self-reflection is powerful. Deshaun leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm and the energy of youth. What if we created workshops? We could invite speakers from different backgrounds, have discussions that challenge people's perspectives. We could include activities that encourage empathy and perspective-taking. We could create a safe space for people to share their experiences and learn from each other. He began outlining his vision. We could do role-playing exercises where people step into the shoes of someone with a different experience. We could have people from different communities share their stories. We could create art projects where people express their feelings about racism and social justice. We could make it interactive and engaging, not just a lecture where people sit passively. Alicia's face lit up as she caught the wave of enthusiasm sweeping through the room. And we could use social media to amplify our message. We could start a campaign where people share their own stories of overcoming prejudice or standing up against racism. We could create a movement. We could use hashtags to track the reach of our message. She pulled up her social media accounts on her laptop. I already have a significant following from my nonprofit work. We could use that platform to share educational content about racism, to highlight inspiring stories, to provide resources for people who want to learn more. We could create a digital community where people can connect and support each other. Alicia continued with growing excitement. We could also create powerful videos that capture people's stories. We could interview community leaders, activists, educators, and everyday people who are doing the work of fighting racism. We could make these videos viral, reaching millions of people who might not otherwise encounter this message. With renewed energy and a sense of collective purpose, the family began brainstorming ideas for their initiatives. They envisioned a series of events that would not only educate but also inspire. They discussed collaborating with local community leaders, educators, and activists to create a multifaceted program that would address the roots of racism while promoting unity and understanding. They talked about creating curricula for schools, developing training programs for corporations, establishing mentorship initiatives, and launching community dialogue series. Each idea built upon the others, creating a comprehensive strategy for social change. We should also think about the long-term impact, Marcus said thoughtfully. This momentum we have right now is powerful, but we need to think about sustainability. We need to build institutions and structures that will outlast our initial enthusiasm. We need to create something that can grow and evolve. Tanya nodded. That's why I'm thinking about formalizing my podcast into a nonprofit organization. We could create a media production company focused on telling stories of resistance and resilience. We could train young people from marginalized communities to be journalists and storytellers. We could give them a platform to tell their own stories. As they spoke, a sense of purpose filled the room. They knew the road ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face it together. They had already witnessed the power of their voices, and they were determined to continue using them to advocate for change. They understood that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for countless others who had experienced discrimination and injustice. Meanwhile, Robert Caldwell was also reflecting on his transformation in the quiet solitude of his penthouse apartment. His journey toward understanding had not been easy or quick. It required him to confront deeply ingrained beliefs and biases that had shaped his worldview for decades. The foundation he had established was flourishing, but it was only the beginning of his commitment to racial justice. Caldwell had begun attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, seeking to educate himself on the experiences of marginalized communities. He reached out to organizations that focused on social justice, offering both financial support and his time. He volunteered for mentorship programs, working with young people in underserved communities, listening to their stories, and learning from their experiences. One particular evening, Caldwell sat in a community center in the Bronx, listening to teenagers talk about their dreams and their obstacles. A young girl named Jasmine spoke about her aspiration to become a doctor, but her parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't afford test prep courses. A boy named Marcus coincidentally sharing a name with the man who had confronted him on national television talked about wanting to go to college but being discouraged by teachers who didn't believe in his potential. As Caldwell listened to these stories, he felt something shift within him. These were not abstract concepts anymore. These were real people with real dreams and real obstacles. And many of those obstacles existed because of systems and structures that people like him had created and perpetuated. After the session, Caldwell approached Jasmine. "I want to help you," he said simply. "I want to make sure you have access to the best test prep resources, the best tutors, everything you need to succeed." Jasmine looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had learned, through hard experience, that promises from privileged people often came with strings attached or disappeared when they lost interest. But Caldwell was serious. Over the next year, he worked with Jasmine, not just financially but personally. He helped her navigate the college application process. He connected her with mentors in the medical field. He celebrated her successes and supported her through her challenges. When Jasmine was accepted to a top university with a full scholarship, she cried. And when she hugged Caldwell, he cried too. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it meant to truly help someone without expecting anything in return. Though many were skeptical of Caldwell's intentions, and rightfully so, given his past was unwavering in his commitment to change. He understood that trust would take time to rebuild, and that some people would never believe in his transformation. He accepted that. He knew he had to demonstrate that accountability was not just a one-time act but a lifelong commitment. He began speaking publicly about his past, acknowledging not only his mistakes but also the privilege that had shielded him from the consequences of his actions for so long. He wrote an article for a major publication titled "The Cost of My Racism: A Confession and a Call to Action," in which he detailed his journey from prejudice to understanding. In the article, he wrote, "For decades, I told myself that I had earned everything I had through hard work and intelligence. I was blind to the ways that my race, my class, and my gender had given me advantages that others didn't have. I was blind to the ways that systems of inequality had been designed to benefit people like me, and I used my blindness as an excuse to look down on people who were struggling, to blame them for their circumstances, to tell myself that they simply weren't working hard enough." He continued, "The truth is, I was afraid. I was afraid that if I acknowledged the role that privilege had played in my success, if I acknowledged that my intelligence and hard work were not the only factors, then I would have to admit that I was not as special, not as superior, as I had always believed. So instead of facing that fear, I constructed an elaborate system of justifications and rationalizations. I told myself stories that made me feel better about myself." The article resonated with many people, but it also drew criticism. Some people accused Caldwell of performative activism, of trying to rehabilitate his image for selfish reasons. Others questioned whether a person could truly change their deeply held beliefs. These criticisms stung, but Caldwell did not shy away from them. Instead, he engaged with them, acknowledged the validity of the skepticism, and recommitted himself to the work. As the months passed, Caldwell's foundation began to make real and measurable impacts in the communities it served. Scholarships were awarded to students who had overcome significant obstacles, enabling them to pursue higher education and change the trajectory of their lives. Community centers received funding to create programs focused on education and empowerment. Caldwell even partnered with local leaders to host town hall meetings, creating a platform for dialogue between residents and law enforcement, between different communities, between people who might otherwise never have the opportunity to understand each other. The work was hard, and the criticism was relentless, but Caldwell remained steadfast. He knew he had to demonstrate that accountability was not just a one-time act, but a lifelong commitment. He began speaking publicly about his past, not just in articles, but at universities, at corporate events, at community gatherings. At one particular speaking engagement at a major university, a student stood up during the question and answer session and asked him a challenging question. "How do we know you are not just doing this to make yourself feel better? How do we know this isn't just about your redemption?" Caldwell paused, considering the question carefully. "You don't," he said finally. "And you shouldn't just take my word for it. Look at what the foundation has accomplished. Look at the lives that have been changed. Judge me by my actions, not by my words. And if you still think I am being selfish, if you still think I am doing this for the wrong reasons, then I accept that. I don't deserve your trust, and I am not asking for it. I am just asking for the opportunity to do better." The student nodded, seemingly satisfied with the honesty of the response. At the one-year anniversary of the Steve Harvey episode, the Johnson family was invited to participate in a community event hosted by Caldwell's Foundation. It was a gathering focused on healing and unity, bringing together individuals from diverse backgrounds to share their experiences and foster understanding. The event was held at a large community center in Manhattan, transformed into a space of beauty and hope. As they arrived at the venue, the atmosphere was electric. The room was filled with people eager to engage in meaningful conversations. There were activists and educators, business leaders and community organizers, young people and elders, people of all races and backgrounds united in their commitment to social justice. The Johnsons were greeted warmly, their presence symbolizing hope and resilience in the face of adversity. They were escorted to a private area where they could prepare for their remarks. As they waited, they reflected on the journey they had been on over the past year. Marcus thought about the conversations he had had with colleagues and friends who had been inspired by his family's courage. He thought about the young, Black professionals he had mentored, helping them navigate the challenges of working in corporate America while maintaining their integrity and their identity. Tanya thought about the listeners who had reached out to her podcast, sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. She thought about the impact her voice had had, not just in raising awareness, but in creating a community of support. Deshaun thought about his acceptance to Harvard Law School, about the scholarship that had made it possible, about the responsibility he felt to use his education to fight for justice. Alicia thought about the children she had worked with, about the transformations she had witnessed, about the hope that had been kindled in young hearts. When it was time for the event to begin, the Johnsons took their places on the stage. The room fell silent as the audience settled into their seats, anticipating the words that would be spoken. Caldwell stood at the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I stand before you today, not as the man I once was, but as someone who is committed to change. I have learned that accountability is not just about acknowledging my past mistakes, it's about taking action to create a future where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, regardless of their race or background." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "A year ago, I was confronted on national television for my racism. At first, I was defensive. I wanted to explain myself, to justify my words. But then I realized that there was no justification. There was no explanation that would make my words acceptable. I had to face the truth. I was a racist, and I had spent my entire life perpetuating harm." The audience listened intently, some nodding in agreement, while others held back tears. Caldwell's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I want to thank you for your courage," he said, turning to the Johnson family. "You have shown me what it means to stand up against hate and prejudice. You have shown me what it means to demand accountability. I am honored to be part of this journey with you, and I am committed to continuing this work for the rest of my life." Marcus stepped forward, his voice strong and clear. "Change is possible, but it requires all of us to do the work. We need to hold each other accountable, and we need to be willing to listen, learn, and grow. It's not always easy, but it's essential. Together, we can create a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." He looked out at the audience, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "I want to speak directly to the people in this room who are struggling with their own biases, their own racism. I want to tell you that it's not too late. You can change. You can grow. You can become an ally in the fight for justice. It won't be easy. You'll have to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. You'll have to be willing to be wrong, but it's possible." Tanya spoke next, her voice filled with the wisdom she had gained from her journey. "What I've learned over this past year is that healing is possible, but it requires vulnerability. It requires us to be honest about our pain, our anger, our fear. It requires us to listen to the pain of others, even when it's uncomfortable. It requires us to sit with the discomfort and not run away from it." She paused, her eyes glistening. "I want to say something to the white people in this room. You don't have to feel guilty for being white, but you do have to acknowledge the ways that whiteness has privileged you. You do have to use that privilege to fight against racism. You do have to be willing to give up some of your power so that others can have equal access to opportunity." Deshaun spoke about his journey from victim to advocate, from despair to hope. When that man said those things to me, I felt small. I felt like maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't smart enough. Maybe I didn't belong. But then I realized that his words had no power over me unless I gave them power. I realized that my intelligence, my worth, my right to succeed those things were not determined by what he thought of me. He looked directly at the young people in the audience. If you were watching this, and you have been told that you are not good enough, that you don't belong, that you can succeed because of your race or your background, telling you right now that those words are lies. You are worthy, you are intelligent, you belong, and you have every right to pursue your dreams. Alicia spoke about the power of education and community. Education is not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about building confidence, about creating a sense of belonging, about opening doors to opportunity. When we invest in education, especially in communities that have been historically underserved, we were not just changing individual lives, we were transforming entire communities. She shared stories of the children she had worked with, of their struggles and their triumphs. These children are brilliant, they are creative, they are resilient. All they need is someone to believe in them, to invest in them, to give them the tools they need to succeed. And when we do that, when we create those opportunities, there's no limit to what they can achieve. As the evening unfolded, stories were shared, connections were made, and hope was ignited. The event served as a powerful reminder that while the journey toward racial equity was long and fraught with challenges, it was also filled with moments of profound beauty and resilience. Workshops were held throughout the evening, with people breaking into small groups to discuss specific topics: white privilege, implicit bias, systemic racism, intersectionality, allyship, and community organizing. Facilitators, many of them members of the Johnson family's extended network of activists and educators, guided these conversations with skill and compassion. In one workshop, a white businessman admitted, for the first time, that he had been complicit in discriminatory hiring practices at his company. He committed to reviewing his hiring policies and implementing changes to ensure greater diversity and inclusion. In another workshop, a young black woman shared how she had internalized racism and learned to love herself. In a third workshop, people from different communities came together to plan a collaborative project to address housing discrimination in their neighborhood. The Johnson family moved through the event, observing these conversations, answering questions, offering guidance. They saw the power of what they had started, the ripple effects of their courage spreading outward in ever-widening circles. Late in the evening, Marcus found himself in conversation with Caldwell. It was an awkward moment at first, filled with the weight of their history. But then Caldwell spoke. "I know I can never fully make amends for what I said, for the harm I caused," Caldwell said, quietly, "but I want you to know that you changed my life. You forced me to see myself clearly, and that was the most painful and the most valuable thing that's ever happened to me." Marcus nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work you were doing, but I also want to be clear. Your redemption is not our responsibility. We don't owe you forgiveness. We don't owe you absolution. What we do expect is that you continue this work, that you remain committed to it even when it's difficult, even when you don't receive recognition or praise." "I understand," Caldwell said, "and I accept that." They shook hands, and in that gesture, there was an acknowledgement of both the pain of the past and the possibility of a different future. As the night came to a close, the Johnsons and Caldwell exchanged heartfelt goodbyes. They knew that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that together they could make a difference in the world. They left the event with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue their work, fueled by the knowledge that they were not alone in this fight. In the months that followed, the work continued. The Johnson family's speaking engagements became increasingly popular, drawing larger and larger audiences. Their initiatives began to take shape, creating tangible change in communities across the country. Marcus's consulting work expanded, and he began working with major corporations to analyze their hiring and promotion practices, identifying areas of bias and recommending changes. His work was rigorous and data-driven, making it difficult for companies to dismiss his findings or make excuses. Tanya's podcast grew into a full-fledged media production company, with a team of young journalists and storytellers working to amplify marginalized voices. They won awards for their work, and their content reached millions of people. Deshawn excelled at Harvard Law School, becoming a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform. He worked on cases involving police brutality and racial profiling, using the law as a tool for justice. Alicia's nonprofit expanded to 10 cities, serving thousands of children and training hundreds of mentors. She became a sought-after speaker on education equity, and her work influenced policy at the state and federal levels. And Robert Caldwell, though his name would forever be associated with his past racism, continued his work with the foundation, demonstrating through his actions that change was possible, that accountability was not just a moment, but a lifetime commitment. As they stepped into the night, the stars twinkling above them, they carried with them the hope that change was not only possible but already in motion. Together, they were committed to building a brighter future, one where understanding, compassion, and justice reigned supreme. The journey was far from over. The work would continue for decades, for generations. But they had started something powerful, something that would outlast them, something that would continue to inspire and transform long after they were gone. And that, they understood, was the greatest legacy they could leave.